The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Folks, hello, welcome to the show. So, what we want to present today is a new 80-20 rule for the private equity industry. And really, what we mean by that is in order to thrive in today's hyper competitive deal sourcing environment, you have got to be concentrating 80% of your time on the 20% of target companies that matter most. And we're going to show you how to do that in just a bit. But first, allow me to introduce myself and breeze through some quick housekeeping. I'm Nick Donato, an industry strategist here at Navatar, which is the premier cloud software provider for the private funds ecosystem. I will be your moderator, and shortly I'll introduce you to Navatar COO Ketan Kankar and PitchBook Managing Director Steve Carver, who are going to be our two deal sourcing experts today. Should you have any questions during today's presentation, by all means send them our way using the GoToWebinar widget tool that should be on your screen there. And what I've done is I've just reserved some time at the end to field them. And as a FYI, we'll make sure to send out a recording of today's broadcast. I know that comes up a lot, so just look for that in your inbox in the coming days. Now, moving on to the next slide, you may be wondering what gives Navatar credibility on this deal sourcing topic. And the short answer is that we are a cloud software and tech provider for private equity deal makers. And so what we do is we offer tools and workflows that give these deal makers a full view of their pipeline. We help them track the status of their deals, and we help them ensure that they're reaching out to the right intermediaries. Because, well, look, if you're managing your pipeline or your relationships with intermediaries from Excel, or tracking your engagement with target companies using even basic CRM, you're likely bleeding deal flow and missing out on what should be your best deal opportunities. And hopefully we'll see why after our presentation is over. Navatar, by the way, has over 600 customers across 35 countries, and that number is growing. We are a Salesforce Gold ISV partner, and we integrate with Box, really, which just means that we've taken the two most trusted names in cloud security and configured them for your business model. So everything comes ready out of the box. And then moving on to the next slide, our partner here today is PitchBook, which is a name that I'm sure all of you are already familiar with. But since its inception in 2007, allow me to mention that the company has covered the full breadth of the private capital markets. And that, of course, started with private equity as its core coverage area. But since then, the company has also expanded to cover venture capital and M&A globally. And its private equity clients are not only leveraging its database for deal execution, but also fundraising now as well. PitchBook, I should also mention, was recently acquired by Morningstar. And so what that means is that it has a full database covering the public markets in addition to its private market intelligence. And that M&A activity covers everything, regardless of a company's sponsorship. So moving on to the next slide, allow me to, or I should say, allow me to give the platform for us to meet our speakers. Kane, can you give us the quick background on you, and then we'll hear from Steve.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name is Ketan Kankar. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Navitor Group. I also oversee all our products and overall product strategy here at Navitor.
And then Steve.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm Steve Carver with PitchBook. I've been with PitchBook for about 9 years, originally building the sales organization here, and post-acquisition by Morningstar, I've moved more into a strategic role, helping get PitchBook data into tools like Navatar and other data providers.
Great. Thanks to both. So there's a way that I'd like to set the stage here. So our topic is the difficulty in finding the right target companies to focus your time on. Allow me to launch a poll to ask the audience exactly what it is that is your pain point here. And we've identified 4 potential pain points. But in order to make sure that we're hitting the right tone, tell us what is the biggest pain point you have when it comes to prospecting. And we'll allow 20 to 25 seconds for you to submit your responses. We'll give it another 10 seconds. Okay, and let's see what we have. Yeah, and so this is not surprising. It's so with 60% of the responses, it is identifying the right target companies. That is no shock. That is in line with what we hear from our clients, and that is simply because there are millions of private companies out there. And even after you refine that number down to what matches your sector or your investment criteria, we are still talking about hundreds of thousands of target companies that you need to find and to identify as the right fit. And then there too, it's not surprising that about 1 in 3 of you are also saying that even after you've managed to build that watch list of target companies, so you've already done the legwork of defining your universe of potential deals, that list often numbers in the tens of thousands. And so the next challenge is saying to yourself, well, which one of these should I focus my time on? Which one of these can I exclude for now? And which one of these do I prioritize? So again, that's in line with what we're hearing and seeing. And allow me to address the pain point by, well, first describing its origins. So if we move on to the next slide here, I want to lay out the past, present, and future of deal sourcing. Because in the old days, I'm sure you all remember this feeling, you would see 10,000 companies on your watch list, and so you're not really knowing where to focus your time. And in fact, that's 1 in 3 of you said that this is exactly your biggest pain point. So you may have gathered these company names from old lists, from conferences, or from previous partners who may have left the firm. And unless these companies, bother to answer your analyst emails, you weren't even sure if they were a right fit for your fund or if they met your investment criteria. Even worse is that firms rarely track their touch points with these companies over time. So let's say a partner who brought in some of these names left the firm, and maybe they had a promising business lunch with one of these targets 2 years ago. And let's say that the outcome of that meeting was to check back when they hit a new growth milestone. It's pretty unlikely that that partner who left had passed on the message or stored it for you somewhere. Or something more common would be analysts tracking which companies they reached out to or which companies they emailed. Most likely they're managing that through an Excel sheet. But these types of things and documents are easily lost. They're not shared at a firm-wide level where other people could use that information. So things were really a mess, and it led to deal makers having to shoot in the dark when it comes to focusing their time on the right target companies. Kate and Steve, would you say I'm getting things right so far?
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think a big piece of it is, everybody wants to cast a wide net. They don't want to miss any opportunities out there. But by doing that, they create so much noise. It's very difficult to actually effectively target those companies that are going to be most likely to be targets.
Yeah, this is Ketan here. I concur, and kind of partly it's also because of historical information, like you mentioned, Nick, that we see a lot of customers when they're starting off with Navitar, they'll have long lists of kind of target companies with very little information about them. So just kind of the sheer volume of the data and having to go through that, and the challenge of reaching out is probably what leads to this challenge.
Well, that takes us to the present because some of these pains have been alleviated. So things have gotten easier because now deal makers have these large databases on these companies to keep track of who still meets their investment criteria. So no longer are analysts reaching out to companies who may or may not be a good fit. They've done their homework. And what's more is that the analyst may also know when the target opened a new office or hired a new CFO, and really other just business intelligence that allows him or her to tailor their pitch. There's just still one thing missing in all this, and that is, sure, we've been able to identify that the target company is attracted to the firm, but does the target company still feel the same way about you? or put a little differently, the analyst is still cold calling the target. They just happen to be doing it in a more personalized manner and with the comfort that the target is actually a company that the fund would want to invest in, which takes us to the future of deal sourcing. And you see that on your screen there now. And now this is key. So deal makers are still relying on databases like PitchBook to refine their watch list and stay up to date on target company news. But they also know which of these targets are actually responsive to their marketing messaging and brand by tracking their total engagement with the firm. And this, by the way, can range from simple things like, hey, which targets are even bothering to open your mass emails, all the way down to more sophisticated strategies like tiering the target companies based on a relationship history that may span years. So the end result is that deal makers are now spending 80% of their time or more on the top 20% of companies that, one, meet their investment criteria, and two, are most receptive to their messaging and their investment strategy. So Kate and Steve, how did I do in my quick history of deal sourcing and where it's headed?
Yeah, I think you got it pretty well dialed in. I think there's a lot to be said for the new data and speed of data coming in. A lot of different signals like social metrics, news mentions, executive moves that can trigger some of those communications to be targeted and very specific, and also identifying who are those trusted advisors to, as you call it in the slide, make those warm introductions at the right time. And some of that is what we focus on here at PitchBook.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is we see this as a challenge of both the volume of companies to reach out to, but also the relevance of the communication that you're having. And the second part often isn't focused on too much, because when you're talking to these companies, you need to now be able to utilize content that's relevant for them, as well as all the other things that Steve mentioned in terms of signals and news related to those companies, and that really helps in getting engaged with these target companies.
Thanks. And so at this point now, I appreciate that we have been talking about things at a high level, and that this is a two-step process. One, leveraging the databases to refine your watch list, and then two, as Kate had mentioned, figuring out how do you become relevant to these target companies so that you're not doing these inefficient cold calls and emails. So what I would like to do is bring on Steve to provide a visual of what this actually looks like, at least as part of the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that the slides that we picked mirror almost exactly what the poll results were. So, that first question of making sure you're not missing anything, making sure you're casting that wide net. And you do, we're seeing in our data that there's a huge uptick in private equity groups buying companies out of venture capital portfolios, out of spin-outs, and the traditional, privately held, generationally owned companies. And so being able to search through that entire universe and get the full coverage in, a broad sector-based search, looking at that ownership status, looking at where they are located, looking at what industries, and getting it really focused on what's in your investment criteria. You don't want to miss anything. But then the next tier is, how do you narrow that focus to look at only the companies that are going to meet the criteria of something that you could invest in? And here's where you can use all of the tools that PitchBook presents to look for those sort of ripe opportunities that are have the most likelihood. And then finally, that last piece, which is filtering out the ones that are certainly not relevant, and by doing this is excluding companies that are too large and too small, that aren't growing, that are located outside of your region, whatever it is that's you specifically want to focus on for your investment criteria.
Great, thanks, Steve. Now, Kane, I'd like to bring you on board at this stage. So Steve has outlined for us the filtering process, making sure that you're finding companies that meet your criteria. Once you're able to refine that list, what do you do then?
Yeah, that's a great segue into how Navatar comes in. And I'll switch screens here, but from your perspective, it's a continuous process, right? So you've already identified the companies that now fit your criteria. The second is, how do you put a strategy in place and work on this so that you can do the outreach the way you want to and get the maximum results for that. So the same list that Steve just showed, you within Navatar, you can maintain what we call as a watch list, right? These are the companies that you want to reach out to on a periodic basis. These are the same list that Steve just generated out of PitchBook, and kind of all the same companies. And these could be, again, based on your criteria, hundreds of companies still that you're reaching out to. So now the outreach to these companies you can still do via email, through direct relationships, but keep in mind kind of what we're also bringing in is we have more intelligence about these companies, right? So the fact that we already have a filtered list is wonderful, right? So that means you instead of hundreds of thousands of companies, it's a much more manageable list. But we also have a lot more intelligence, and then we can utilize that in a much better manner, right? So with this list, the first thing we recommend is having an outreach strategy, right? So how often do you want to reach out? What do you want to reach out to them about? You can run campaigns for the list from here, and like in this case for our watch list, we have a quarterly outreach. So every quarter we're reaching out to all of these companies. But apart from just doing an email blast to them, and kind of that's something that I'm sure many of you may be doing, we can now utilize the additional information that we have to further refine the content and going back to kind of being relevant, right? So instead of sending, let's say you acquired a new company, instead of sending it out to this entire list, you may want to filter it down and say, depending on the the acquisition or kind of what may be of interest. Maybe you want to only send it out to all the construction and engineering companies. And why do you want to do that? Because unless the content is relevant, the odds of these companies even reading your emails are very less, right? So now I can filter it down. I have a much more manageable list, and then I can create the communication that I want. So maybe kind of this TMS soft announcement, and then I can send it out, right? So allowing the data and additional information that you're getting from PitchBook allows me to be more relevant also in the overall campaigns that are going out. So that's part one. But going back here, what you really want to also get down to is a rating system, and you'll see rating A's and B's. And again, you want the ability to segment or tier these companies. There are lots of ways in which you can do that. Uh, it could be kind of on the simplistic side based on the length of your relationship, the uh, the number of touch points you've had, or you can also become more sophisticated. So if you have a website with a lot of content, it's very easy to now integrate all of that in here to automatically create tiering and segmentation. And what the segmentation allows you to do is, again, focus on the most important ones. Focus on the companies that are more likely to respond to your outreach. Now, many of you, apart from this, may also have some analysts calling out and reaching out to these companies. If I'm an analyst, this is still too big a list for me. And secondly, I need to kind of it becomes difficult to track which companies I should be reaching out to next, right? So what Navatar allows me to do is produces a list for me right here. So I can go and say which are the companies that I need to call. Right? And these are companies that are automatically assigned to me within Navatar, and I can reach out to them anytime I'd like to. Right? So I see here are on my today's list, I have 3 companies. Taking it one step further, right? So let's go into Sumo Logic. Now, when I'm reaching out to this company, this is again going back to something we covered earlier. I need as much information and intelligence about this company as possible, right? So I do have background information. That's great. I have a history of kind of all my email campaigns that we've done, right? Which is again giving me some perspective. But if I scroll down now, I have a lot more data and lot more relevant information here right now, right? So I have data about Sumo Logic. I can go into news and I can see there's been certain things um, that are relevant for me. So, for example, they're sponsoring the Illuminate 2018 conference. That's again, if I have team members who go to these conferences, this is something that's very relevant because again, if I'm going to this conference, I do get to meet one of my target companies. Right? Also, news about kind of other investments that they've done. So all of this allows me to one research and figure out that it is indeed the right company for us. And secondly, when I'm talking to them, I can utilize this to have more relevant conversations, right? And then along with that, actually the fact that I can get the PitchBook data right into Navitor allows me to, again, as I'm doing my analysis, be able to use this and utilize this to say, okay, who the investors are, and I can run any kind of analysis that I need based on this data that's out there. Once kind of I have this information, I have the intelligence. If I'm reaching out to them, obviously I can log my notes, but at some point before they can share any details, I need to sign an NDA. You can run that entire process from here. And it's not about kind of the signing of the NDA, but as many of you may know, these are things that you don't want to waste time in kind of chasing paperwork. You want to kind of spend time doing research and identifying and reaching out to these companies. The fact that you can generate an NDA, you can send it out for e-signature right from within Navatar makes the process very seamless. You can kind of do all of that from one go, but also it keeps track of where the documents are, right? So when I'm on Sumo Logic, if the question is have they signed an NDA or not, I can see on their profile itself that the NDA, not only the fact that the NDA has been generated, it's waiting for counter signature, right? So things like these, the kind of are allowing you to become more efficient in a process that already kind of is very manual and very labor intensive. So as many things as these that you can bring into play that allow you to become more efficient and get kind of focus on the companies that matter in terms of your target areas, the better the whole business development process becomes. And then, of course, you can then monitor and track and all of that within Navatar to make sure that kind of the watch list process is working, the industries that you're reaching out to, the companies that you're reaching out to are all relevant in here. So those kind of, I thought I'll cover that briefly just to provide some more visuals to how the data that you're getting and how the intelligence that you're getting from PitchBook can now be acted upon to further your business development process.
Thanks, Kane.
With that, Nick, yeah, let's see if we have any questions.
Yep, and I see a few that have come in. The first one, well, this is relevant to what you just showed, Kate, and they're asking what is the best practice for segmenting their watch list into those different tiers that you described?
Yeah, so I think the number one rule there is the segmentation strategy should depend on obviously what kind of information you're tracking and kind of what the overall status is. What I mean by that is, for example, if you have a website that is very interactive and has a lot of content, um, you should absolutely build all of that in there into the overall segmentation strategy. Because if a target company is spending time on your website, going through different pages, maybe attending events that you have, all of those are very relevant items that you should not be losing out on. Either way, it's kind of in the end, it has to be something that is quantifiable and measurable, right? So on kind of on the more sophisticated side, you can set up algorithms and rules in there so that if if a target company, let's say, has clicked on 5 emails and has gone to your website and visited 4 pages and read 2 blogs, for example, they get a score of 10. So you can automate this scoring mechanism that can automatically then segment things for you. But you can also, I mean, you don't have to be that fancy. You can also go by kind of simple metrics like the length of the relationship, the number of meetings or number of phone calls you've had over the last kind of X number of years, the number of email clicks that you've seen. All of these are measurable items, and they can automatically be then fed into the segmentation criteria. And in the end, what you want is probably maybe 3 segments, max 4, not more than that, where you can then divide up all your target list and then have your outreach strategy tailored to each tier.
Yeah, and then just to add to that quickly, it's also going to somewhat depend on your firm's bandwidth. So the more resources you have, if you have an analyst, that gives you more capacity to reach out. A second question, Steve, this one's more for you. Someone's asking about the differences between the data providers. Why choose PitchBook over other options?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. Obviously, coverage is a key piece. You want to make sure that any database that you select is covering the companies that are relevant to you, and somebody that's covering the middle market, that's covering privately held businesses, those companies that are being acquired by private equity, whether they're companies that are rapidly growing in venture capital portfolios, or whether, again, they're those multi-generational family-owned businesses. You want to make sure that the coverage is there. And then you need the tools to be able to uncover the ones that are most applicable to you for your investment strategy. And so I would say that breadth of coverage, and then having the tools to help refine those searches and make sure that they're pulling out the diamonds in the rough for you.
We have time for one last question. I want to keep things under half an hour. And this is just a general question. Someone's asking, what kind of time commitment would it be to use the Navatar PitchBook deal sourcing engine?
This is Ketan. Let me take a first stab at that. I mean, there is a little bit of a learning curve, but we have lots of customers who use Navitar on a day-to-day basis. So I don't think it's as big a challenge as it may seem like. I think if you're coming from a totally manual process, sometimes just the nature of that process tends to overwhelm the thought of kind of moving to a system. But it's something that we've kind of we've mastered over the years, and we've kind of tried to keep it as simple as possible. And there's trainings available, so overall I don't feel that it's that onerous a process to master.
From the PitchBook perspective, it is that the platform is very intuitive. However, we have a very white glove service. You get a dedicated account manager who walks you through exactly how to set up the searches and run the systems exactly as you want to have them. And the integration with Navitar is incredibly seamless. It takes less than an hour to set up a few defaults of where data flows, and you're off to the races.
So, folks, I was able to keep my promise to have things under half an hour. I know that you all lead busy lives, but allow me to just quickly point out, too, that this was a high-level demonstration of the strategy that we're seeing top deal makers use to find the right target companies, so that 80% of their time is focused on that 20% that matter most. If you have any follow-up questions, or if you would like to take a deep dive into this strategy, you could see our contact details on that last slide there. Feel free to reach out to either myself or Steve, who's representing PitchBook in this webinar. And on behalf of both firms, I'm Nick Donato, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Nick.